do, though, is to start a conversation about where schools are on their journey. And I want to just take you through that in a moment about how that works, because these are improvement journeys or trajectories. There's an app which I have on my phone which helps me with the Underground in London, which when I click onto it and I want to find a train, and when it's due at Waterloo or Westminster where I get on, it's got like a Pac-Man. Remember Pac-Man? It just moves along the line. I think that's what I've got in my head with this, that schools are moving forwards, they're getting stuck, or they're falling backwards. But how do we know that? How do we assess that, and how do we understand it? So I think there are 4 phases that go through this. So you'll have seen, if I just go back one, you'll see on the left-hand side there, the 4 phases there, and the 8 journeys come off the phases. My first phase I've called the stabilised phase. And what I mean by that here, the observable features that I see in schools that are in the stabilised phase are some of these factors. And they're broken schools. They're really difficult schools. They're schools in a really bad way. And there are 50 things that you need to do, but you can't do 50 things. There's no capacity for that. You've got to choose the first 3 or 4 things and do it really well. The only true thing you can guarantee is if you've been asked to go and help that school, on day 1, it's worse than anybody told you it was. And so therefore, some of those features are really important indicators of it. But if I'm a governor in that school, what questions am I asking? So I also want to build a narrative for governance as well that talks about the role of governance in school improvement. So if I'm a governor in a school that is in my stabilised phase, these are some of those questions that I think are really integral to that journey. So for example, number 2, are we effective at prioritising the strategies that we need to implement? Because governors will want to see it moving fast as well. And they've got to be able to manage their expectations of how fast you can improve this. What about number 6? How do we understand the short-term progress the school is making without having to wait for the next meeting? How do we know in between our governors' meetings that this is still working? What help and support are we giving to our leadership team to develop it? But schools do come out of the stabilised phase and they move into the next one, which I've called the repair. So you stabilised it. It's no longer chaotic. Those first 3 or 4 things that you did have started to have an impact. And now some of the things that you're seeing in the repair phase are around the stability of leadership. The support that you need to help you is now beginning to be gathered around you, and it's beginning to have an impact. You're starting to see individual pockets of improved performance in teams, in departments, groups of children. Behaviour is improving. But if you're a school in repair phase, and it's the Friday before you break up for Christmas, and it's windy and rainy at lunchtime, the afternoon is likely to be back in stabilised. That's the way it works. That's how school improvement is. So these are not fixed points. That's why, for me, it's not a capability framework. It's not about saying, like, your school is requiring improvement, because the requiring improvement judgment is a blend of good and special measures as well as requiring improvement. I'm talking about what does it feel like on the ground, day in, day out. And then you ask, as a governor, the questions of this in the repair phase. So you've commissioned and you're probably paying for this external support. Is it doing what you think it's doing? How are they reporting back to you as a governing body about the effect of it? Number 3, are the leaders in the school coping? I don't know how many of you have done a special measure school and moved it forward, but it's really hard work. It's quite exhilarating, but it's really hard work. What pressure are those people under and how are you looking after them? That's part of the values of governance, I think, in this equation. And then we move to my 3rd phase, which is the improve phase. And at this point, you're kind of making an assumption that it's never going to go back to where you started from. It'll wobble a bit from time to time, but those early strategies are now working. And then you've moved away from 100-day action plans into thinking about 12, 18-month plans. And the school is beginning to become a much higher performing school in terms of all the measures you'd expect to see it. And the kind of questions that you ask from the perspective of governance at that stage are around these things. Number 2, are we getting the balance right between quality assurance and operational improvement? Because the danger is that they keep measuring stuff. They keep measuring and monitoring and checking. Where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? Just have a conversation about the challenge and how difficult it still is. Number 4, what are the areas that we still need to repair? And then the final phase, I've borrowed unashamedly from the Maslow hierarchy. You'll be familiar with that, the sustain phase, where I think this is about schools making that shift from being a capacity taker to a capacity giver. I'm now a sponsor, I'm now a teaching school, I'm now an NLE, I'm now working with schools in my community, which 4 or 5 years ago would have been unthinkable. And the school is now actually not just performing really well, it's innovating and developing new practice. And that's the cycle of journey. And you can't put a timeline on it, but I think it's 3 to 5 years. But it might be 7, and it might be 4. It doesn't really matter what the time is. The point is the conversation we need to have as a system as leaders in the education system today is where our schools are on this journey. And then those are the questions which I've talked about in terms of governance. And number two is a really big one. What capacity do we have to support another school? Because governors who've made that journey will be really risk averse about taking good practice out of your school and worrying that it'll fall backwards. You have to be able to build that conversation and that capacity around that. So these 8 trajectories that I described to you that are pinned by these principles, they're not a judgment. They're a self-assessment tool. They're a dialogue and a discourse around where our schools are on the journey. And there are critical points of those journeys. So if I take this pattern, if I take A, for example, across the top, I think these are some of our strongest performers in the system. But about 50% of them are not supporting another school. And you might say they bought the right not to have to do so. But I think the moral imperative of improving every child's life chances says that it's great that you've done that for your kids, but what are you doing to help other people? So I've tried to think about those journeys in this way. So you'll see the next few slides will go quite quick, but the way I've described it is what I think the journey is, what the key question is around that journey, and where they can play a role in the system. So those strong performers, the question for me is, do they support the improvement in the system in a proactive way, and how do we engage with those who aren't? But these guys are capacity givers. These are really, really strong schools that could and should be doing more, contrasted with the schools that I'm most worried about. Because if I was a parent, I'd want my child in Journey A school, surely. Yet my postcode, where I'm born, where I work, where I live, actually says my school is at the other end of the spectrum. But how do we know what works best in those schools? How do we build an evidence base of how you turn those schools around? And how do we move them as quickly as possible? Because if it does take 5 years, and I've got an 11-year-old in that school today, have I really got to wait till they're year 11 before they get a good result? I can't wait that long. So it's that journey between the sustained improvement versus the continual improvement. I'm going to pick up the next two here, B and C. B are the ones who I think are the rapid improvers. They're the straight line going from the bottom left to top. And these schools do exist. These schools do improve really quickly, 18 months, special measures to outstanding. There are lots of examples, but you can't build a system on it because it's rare, but it does happen. And similarly, we have schools doing C, top left to bottom or the middle of my graph. These are schools that fall very quickly. Sometimes it's around a safeguarding issue. And safeguarding issues in that context are a product of maybe leadership and governance eye off the ball, or schools haven't caught up with the curriculum changes. Their progress ain't not compliant in the secondary school. You know the picture. But a few schools fall very quickly, 2 or 3 Ofsted judgments. If I take the next two, D and E, I spent a long time thinking about the description of these. D, slow decliner, sounds like quite a messy phrase, but what I mean here are schools that have just become a bit complacent. They're above floor, they've probably got a good judgment, they're full, it's a great place to work, staff aren't worked particularly hard, most are on upper threshold 3, but they don't do anything for it, you know the pattern I mean. But actually, if we could get those schools to really put an energy burst into their leadership, they could become some of our best schools in the system, and they have a role to play in it. And E is very similar, and I think this is about the prevention phase, because these are the schools that probably are a bit stuck, and they can go one of 2 ways. And how do we encourage them? And I think the way you encourage those schools is to help another school. They don't need help, they need to play a wider system role. Because I don't know about your experience, but mine is whenever I was ahead working with another school, I think I learned as much as they did from me, I hope. And that's an important part of it. And then the last two, I think, are my improvers and my improver decliners, as I call them. So the steady improvers, I think, are the model. If I just go back, they're the red line. It looks like a typical sigmoid curve. In this school, you start the journey, and because you challenge the behavior of the children, but also the behavior of the staff, it gets worse before it gets better. And then it comes back up the other side, and it gets better, and it improves steadily to the top of the second curve. And what marks the difference for me between journey F and journey G is that at that point, F says we need to do something else. We need to refresh things, and we need to go again and push on to become a great school. Whereas on journey G, the danger is that we go, do you know what? We're going to have a year off because we worked really hard. And actually, that's not how it works, as you know. It's that continuous cycle of improvement. So I'm hoping that what I've seen around and what you've heard me say is these are about ways in which we have a different conversation amongst ourselves as professionals and in the world that I occupy with RSCs and academies and MATs about where schools are on these journeys and are they getting the right support. A year ago, I was banging the drum repeatedly saying multi-academy trusts must have a school improvement plan for their organisation. Teaching School Alliances must have a school improvement plan that fits the purpose of their organisations that they're supporting. Now it's about bespoking those improvement plans to the needs of the individual schools. And unless we have an honest conversation about some of these journeys, I think it's going to be challenging to do that. So that's how I intend to use this. We're doing some of it now. I'm sharing it with you. I'm sure you'll have some questions about it. I hope it's a self-assessment tool. You know, those of you that have an impact on other schools, where are those schools on that journey? I certainly want MATs and their boards and their executive teams to take a really good look at it and work out where it's going to be in the future. But also, how does that reflect around capacity giving and taking? How do we make sure we get the blend and the balance right? And I'll finish with this one because in a way it pulls the whole thing together, because it's all well and good talking about the trajectories, but you also need to have a sense of what's informing it, I think. And for me, it's this. So there are two circles on the screen, the left-hand circle around monitoring and the right-hand circle around delivery. I think the challenge is this. I think people think that because they're really good at the diagnosis and the monitoring, that that's school improvement. It's not. It's the diagnostic that informs school improvement. So many of the MATs that I work with and I've challenged over the last year, and quite a number of teaching school alliances that are within those MATs, they monitor really, really effectively, do all of the things in my diagnosis box which you'd recognise. But unless the monitoring throws up the challenge that needs to be solved, then through the delivery circle, then there's something missing around this. So I went to visit a trust just before the summer holidays, and probably saw some of the most effective monitoring I've seen.